When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, it brought another powerhouse country into the war, which was the USA.
In 1941, the United States was trying desperately to stay out of World War II.
But on December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed a naval base in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor.
After this had happened, President Roosevelt had no choice but to join the war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
The past two quotes you just heard were spoken by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor in a speech to declare war against Japan.
When the Japanese bombed the United States, they had a plan. They were going to attempt to take over the Pacific while other countries were fighting elsewhere.
The Japanese saw the giant American fleet of ships at the Hawaiian base as a quote-unquote dagger pointed straight at our throats. But they also saw an opportunity to destroy the entire naval fleet at once using an air bomb.
Other than Pearl Harbor, the Japanese struck in many other Pacific nations as well. Some examples are the Philippines and Guam.
On Christmas Day in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the British surrendered in Hong Kong. After the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, the Americans had to use some strategies. One of their strategies was to devote 1/3 of all of their resources to the war against Japan instead of the war versus all of the other countries. For the first time, the United States had to fight in two places at the same time, which were in the Pacific against Japan and overseas in Europe against everybody else.
Even though the USA's fleet of ships was severely damaged at Pearl Harbor, the USA expanded it back out and used the fleet in the Pacific War against Japan.
Other than using the fleet of ships, the USA was considering to strike an air raid on Japan. An air raid is a dropping of bomb from one plane into a country during a war.
An admiral named Yamamoto was concerned that the air raid would breach Japan's very hard defenses.
So the military decided that to avoid the disaster of breaching Japan's very hard defenses, they would launch the air raid 500 miles away from Tokyo.
A mere 15 days after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army landed in Luzon, which is a major city in Japan.
On that same day, December 22nd, 1941, the fleet of naval ships was at sea and at the ready to fight against Japan.
As the president was eating lunch in his Oval Office, he heard of the attack and how two other areas, the British colonies in Southeast Asia, had been attacked by the Japanese also. He then heard that Britain would declare war the next day. Adding on to all of the chaos of Pearl Harbor, one day after, Germany and Italy declared war on the USA because of their pact with Japan.
Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans couldn't care less about the war as long as they weren't in it.
However, after the attack, people's minds quickly changed and they started to want to be in the war and get revenge against Japan. The one thing the USA was not short of was in World War II soldiers. People flocked to recruiting centers eager to get into the war and fight for their country. Even though the USA had the soldiers to fight, they were missing the supplies of weaponry. Even though they were in Japan days after Pearl Harbor, the real fighting began 4 months later. They had an extremely low level of confidence and were lacking a good attitude. When the USA bombed Tokyo, it was called the Doolittle Raid. About 25,000 people died when Tokyo went up in flames. We dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima on August 6th and August 9th of 1945.
Shortly after we dropped the atomic bomb, the United States President Truman announced that Japan had surrendered. The war officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, when General Douglas MacArthur of the USA accepted the Japanese surrender from General Yoshihiro Umezu on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
Every year, the United States of America's victory over Japan is celebrated on September 2nd.
It is called Victory Over Japan Day and is a state holiday in Rhode Island.
So as you can tell by the defeat of the Japanese, when they bombed Pearl Harbor, they brought the United States into the war which ultimately led to their defeat, and another powerhouse country fighting for their other side.